Hello and welcome to live programming here at the More Freedom Foundation. I think we're working. I was having some trouble with one of my streaming platforms, but let me know if you're here. Let me know if I'm coming through okay in the chat. We are talking about what's happening in the Red Sea. We are talking about the way that the Houthis, often described as an Iran-backed rebel group, but more accurately described as the government of Yemen, have been attacking first, starting about a month ago, shipping that could be plausibly tied to Israel, and now they are targeting more or less all shipping in the Red Sea. This has come to a head over the past couple days. As it's become clear that they're not going to stop this, and more major shipping companies, major oil companies, have been announcing that they're just going to avoid the Red Sea. Now, I think there is plausibly a way that you could describe what the Houthis are doing here as one of the strongest anti-genocide actions undertaken by any government or group this century. I think that's certainly a fair way to characterize what they're doing. My problem with what the Houthis are doing comes from my now most of a decade of focusing on the conflict in Yemen, and I think it's really, despite how altruistic this action could be seen as being, despite how well it works for the politics of Ansar Allah, the Houthi movement, how it helps them in Yemen and abroad. It's just sheer vandalism for people who care about Yemen, for people who care about that conflict finally ending. It's an indictment of the world in general that it's taken this, frankly, quite nasty little rebel group to take the moral action of trying to stop Israel from what it's doing. And frankly, the chances of the Yemeni people suffering massively for this Houthi choice are very high and growing by the day. So I think it probably won't work in stopping Israel from its campaign of extermination in Gaza, and it is potentially going to make things infinitely worse for the Houthis. I'm going to talk about this in somewhat general terms, what the stakes are here, what the news is, and then I'm just going to dive into what I like to do, which is sort of history of Yemen and the Houthis. Apologies if you've been here many times. It's probably not new content for you, but I do think it's worth viewing as the Houthis have been taking this really rather massive step out onto the world stage. It's worth reviewing the history of the Houthis, who they are, how they came to be, and it won't surprise you very much to hear that I think that the United States is at the center of the story of Yemen, the story of the rise of the Houthis. And of course, the Gulf monarchies, which are just U.S. client states. Before we get into that, I want to point out that the live chat is something that I just don't have the mental energy to pay attention to while I'm delivering the presentation, which will be sort of the first half hour, 45 minutes, maybe as long as an hour of this presentation. I simply just don't have the energy to look at the chat and talk. And so for that, we have Logo Cool Extreme. He is the official monitor. He will tell you if you are acting out. He will warn you once. If you do not comply with what he says, he will boot you off. There is no appeal from the court of Logo. Basically, you're allowed to say many things about the politics of this era, the region. You're allowed to say anything you want about me. You can mock my stupid haircut and my stupid face, my stupid ideas. Go for it. What we do ask is that you be is that you treat other people in the chat with respect. This means no disruption. This means no spamming the chat. This means no attacking other people in the chat. And if you can please hold off on any kind of genocidal seeming language, that would be for the best. And Logo will warn you if you are not doing so. As an additional administrative point, I am ill. I'm kind of feel like I'm doing in middle age. I'm now just creating a cautionary tale about vaccines. You should take them. A couple weeks back, I had COVID for the second or third time, and it was the first time it did me any damage at all. Like, it actually took me out for a couple days, which had never been my COVID experience before, because I haven't taken a COVID vaccine in a year or two. So should have taken that. Also, should have taken the flu vaccine because I think I've got something else just 2 or 3 weeks later. So yeah, should have taken my vaccines. Didn't because not out of any kind of weird um, political affiliation, but just because I've got a strong constitution. I don't need damn vaccines. Here to tell you that at 44, I needed those vaccines, and I've been kind of laid low for weeks at a time, maybe for the first time in my life, because I'm an old man who refused to take his vaccines, and that was stupid. Anyway, let's talk about what's happening. The Red Sea is linked to the Suez Canal, which is a tremendously important artery of international commerce. I was actually surprised to find, this was just from Bloomberg, saying that it's only 12% of seaborne commerce that goes through the Suez Canal. I honestly thought it might have been higher. But when you consider the fact that the largest flows of commodities are probably Middle East oil going to China and Japan and other Asian countries that does not need the Suez Canal, and the massive flood of Chinese goods towards the Americas, the United States specifically, but also countries up and down two continents. I guess it does make sense that the Suez Canal, Europe generally, is becoming more and more of a backwater, especially as Europe gets more and more of its petroleum resources from the United States. That is not in any way to say that this is not a problem for Europe. It is a huge problem for Europe. It is not a OMG 1973 style, Europe's going to run out of oil and gas. No, but it is just another economic whack over the head at a period of time that they really, really didn't need that. And that is a real problem for Europe. It is a huge problem, unfortunately, I was just reading this, for an array of MENA countries that really don't need another kick in the face either. Specifically, the country that this threatens the most is a country that we've talked about being worried about throughout this Gaza crisis, but also for years on this channel, and that's Egypt. Egypt is the country that owns and runs the Suez Canal, which was built in the 1800s, sort of revolutionized travel between Europe and Asia, commerce between Europe and Asia, and since the 1950s they have owned that as sort of a national company, and it is a tremendously important source of foreign money for Egypt. Egypt, as we've covered many times before, is an economic basket case. The really nasty dictator, Sisi, is already under immense pressure because of the way that he's been facilitating the Israeli destruction of Gaza. If Israel gets to do what it wants, which is transfer as many Gazans as it possibly can to Egypt, the Sisi government is likely to fall. Kneecapping the Sisi government by essentially shutting down the Suez Canal and that source of foreign funds for the Israeli government is also a way to really put the Egyptian government in danger, and that's truly terrifying. Europe basically turned itself into a right-wing basket case over the past 8 years on the strength of a single million refugees from Libya and Syria. Now we're talking, Egypt is a country of 110 million. So yeah, the potential for negativity there is very, very high. Unfortunately, I absolutely see paths where this action, specifically what the Houthis are doing is they are using, in one case, a helicopter, ballistic missiles. I've talked many times that I'm not your defense industry minutia guy. I couldn't tell you what the difference between a kind of missile is, but they're using drones, missiles, and actual, at least one instance, an actual by helicopter special forces looking guys hijacking of shipping in the Red Sea. These attacks are actually not that effective, I think is probably a fair way to describe them. They're, at this point, they sort of launched this campaign in a very big way on Sunday, November 19th, so just about exactly a month ago now, as of this broadcast. And that was the one where they had a carefully edited video of a Houthi helicopter going and taking a tanker. Was it some kind of ship that may have had some relationship to some relationship to Israel. For the first couple weeks, it seemed like they were making a point of trying to target Israeli related ships, but those became harder and harder to find. So now they're just targeting everybody. They're not particularly effective. I think it's really only been one or two ships that have been, or three ships that have been hampered, but there have been, I think, dozens, or at least a dozen attacks. And what that means for shipping industry, for these companies that have to pay insurance, that have to deal with the risk. I mean, the sort of financial math of risk is really probably, half of what these companies do. On top of actually shipping things from point A to point B. And just the Houthis, no matter how ineffective their attacks have been, the fact that they're just declaring a free-for-all on all shipping in the Red Sea until Israel stops the slaughter in Gaza means that folks aren't going to want to use the Red Sea anymore. There was some question about this. There was a question about how much of a free-for-all the Houthis were going to do. And I think that what we've gotten over the past week or so is clarity. And the Houthis are just going to keep attacking until Israel stops its, little extermination campaign. Obviously, I would like Israel to stop that extermination campaign. So would the vast majority of the people, countries, and governments in the world. But the United States and its vassal states happen to be the most wealthy and most heavily armed countries in the world. So instead, what we're going to get is what was announced over the past 24 hours, Operation Prosperity Guardian, which is a coalition of the willing, if you will. I know that a lot of folks on this, a lot of my audience, there's a lot of my audience that's older than I am, a lot of audience that's my age, but I know that a lot of my audience is also a decade or two younger than I am. And just like that phrase, a coalition of the willing, is just so nightmarishly familiar from the 2003 Iraq War, when the United States decided to jump in to destroy Iraq and managed to collect a few people who would be willing to work with them. And that's sort of the vibe I get from Operation Prosperity Guardian. It also brings me back to one of the most horrifying, not horrifying, but just one of the most almost inexplicably forgotten wars that the United States has ever engaged with. Andrew Basovich, I think he's still the president of the Quincy Institute, really fascinating guy, I believe right-leaning Vietnam War veteran who is stridently against U.S. intervention. But he points out that actually the first Gulf War is not the war against Saddam Hussein in 1990, 1991, the way we refer to it. It was actually a war to save Saddam Hussein in 1987, 1988 that is being dropped almost completely down the memory hole. So Operation Prosperity Guardian is a lot like Operation Earnest Will, which is forgotten for many, many good reasons. There's the USS Vincennes controversy, where a U.S. ship shot down a civilian Iranian airliner, murdering 200 plus people. There's the USS Stark attack, where the guy we were defending, Saddam Hussein, attacked a U.S. naval ship. I think, and I believe this was by mistake, but it's interesting. A lot of people are really obsessed with the USS Liberty, a instance in the 1960s when Israel attacked a U.S. naval ship by mistake. This also happened in the 80s in Iraq, which is another good reason to forget this. But essentially, in 1987, it looked like Iraq was at risk of losing the war against Iran that it had started. So the United States joined in nominally to protect Kuwaiti shipping, but somehow in practice this involved sinking most of the Iranian Navy and helping Iraq crawl back to the territorial definitions at the start of the war, at the beginning of the 1980s. So it is really sad, I think is the word that I'm looking for, to see us now 40 years later on a much more ridiculous, smaller stakes level, and much more indefensibly because we're essentially going, if we're undertaking this operation, we are undertaking this operation to defend Israel's program of extermination. That's what we're doing here. So it's sort of the classic Marx line is like, history repeats itself as farce. This is history repeating itself as genocidal farce. Operation Earnest Will in the late 1980s is really important because that's sort of the establishment of CENTCOM throughout the Cold War, a period where I'm not entirely certain there was much of any threat to the United States after the mid-1950s, but regardless, it was certainly an era of much more heightened geopolitical competition, an era of when Middle East oil and gas was much more important to the United States. And throughout that period, we had almost no troops in the Middle East. It was Operation Earnest Will that saw the building out of, I believe, those naval bases in Bahrain. I'm not sure exactly when we started, putting in thousands of troops in Qatar and Kuwait, but that could have been more, 4 or 5 years later when we went to war against Saddam Hussein for the first time. But it's really striking that we had almost no troops in the Middle East when it mattered to us. We're just there to use weapons. We're just there because the Middle East provides a degree of instability that we can't find anywhere else. And Washington, D.C. is addicted to selling weapons, and the Middle East is the place to do that. So to see, after a lot of talk for at least a decade now about the United States pulling out of the Middle East, to see it's just really on the other side of the Arabian Peninsula, be diving into a similar... So Operation Earnest Will was about freedom of navigation in the Straits of Hormuz and the Persian Gulf, making sure that the Saudis and the Iraqi and the Kuwaitis could get their oil out. After, again, this is Iraq that started blowing up Iranian oil infrastructure when they realized that they were losing the war. And the Kuwaitis were helping the Iraqis sell their oil because then the Iranians, who were more militarily powerful, were blockading the Iraqis. So anyway, so that was on the Persian Gulf, freedom of navigation in the Persian Gulf, and now 40 years later, I guess 35 years later, we're now launching another action like this on the other side of the Persian Gulf. To be clear, I do think that with the incredibly low bar of CENTCOM, United States Central Command actions over the past 30 years, this is probably one of the more rational uses of it. There is a benefit to the world, unlike anything we've done in Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Afghanistan. There is a benefit to the world. There's a benefit to our vassal states in Europe of unhindered transit through the Red Sea. And that just makes this more frustrating, that this is actually kind of a valid reason for the United States to be involved. Of course, this valid reason for the United States to be involved in defending the Red Sea is because a U.S. client state is enacting a program of extermination against its own citizens. That's another key point that I try to emphasize in Gazans are not an enemy state. The Palestinians are not Israeli enemies. They are Israeli citizens. They have ID numbers that identify them as wards of the Israeli government. The two-state solution has never existed. Israel is just a client state that is attempting to exterminate its population in a significantly darker and more... it's like doing what the worst nightmare visions of what China is doing to the Uyghurs. That's what Israel is doing to the Palestinians right now. And I think it's important to say, to emphasize that while, yes, defending freedom of navigation in the Red Sea is tremendously important and tremendously worthwhile, the reason we have to defend the navigation in the Red Sea is because Israel is trying to exterminate 2 million of its own citizens. So this is a lot like, in even more illegitimate sense, a lot like our war in Ukraine, which is absolutely a noble and worthwhile pursuit to defend Ukraine from a Russian invasion that we spent 20 years doing everything we could to bring about. Just general feelings about U.S. intervention, and they don't make me feel particularly good. The biggest weapon, frankly, and this gets into more Yemen history here, recent Yemen history, and exactly who are the Houthis. The biggest weapon, the biggest awkwardness that the United States faces because of this Yemen, these Yemeni attempts to blockade the Red Sea, is a kind of embarrassment, frankly. I've said for almost a decade now that anybody who looks at the war in Yemen, it's not like the Israel-Palestinian conflict where there's decades of propaganda around it that are just designed to make it look more complicated. It's not like the Syrian conflict where absolutely the United States started that war, but it's true that the Assad regime was really gross. No, if you look at the Yemeni conflict for more than 10 seconds, you know that the Saudis are the villains, and you know that the United States has been supporting incredible villainy there since 2015. So that's sort of the biggest weapon, and I think probably the reason why the United States didn't start a large bombing campaign against Yemen on November 20th, the day after this first hijacking. Because the sad fact is that the United States and its allies have been trying to destroy the Houthi movement for a solid 9 years now, and have failed miserably. And it's the embarrassment of not really wanting people to look into in any detail into what the Houthis are and what they represent. Because it's quite clear that they are the product of incredible U.S. and Saudi mismanagement of this conflict and of Yemen more generally, going back decades. So first off, the Houthis. It is always irritating to me when people describe the Houthis as a resistance movement or an Iran-backed militia group. The Houthis are, and have been since 2014, the de facto government of Yemen. The Saudis invaded with extensive U.S. support in 2015 to stop them from taking the last city in Yemen. This was a civil war that had happened and a civil war that had been won by the Houthis because the Saudis and the UAE, two fabulously rich, very militarily equipped by the United States governments with massive U.S. support, including aerial refueling, intelligence, targeting, probably some special forces stuff we haven't heard about. They were able to very quickly kick the Houthis out of a sort of small southern section of Yemen where the Houthis had a lot less legitimacy, and their then ally, Ali Abdullah Saleh, the 3-decade strongman of Yemen, had no legitimacy. So they were able to, because there was a southern resentment of the northerners with massive, massive support from the Saudis, from the United States, the Saudis and the UAE, the Southerners were able to kick the Houthis out of the south, like sort of historic southern Yemen with some details. There's definitely some complications there, some front lines that are not quite matching southern Yemen, a country that was sort of independent, really was separately colonized by the British and was independent until 1990 or thereabouts. Don't quote me on that year. So Saudi Arabia and the UAE were quickly able to kick the Houthis out of South Yemen, where they had very little legitimacy, and their ally Saleh was very hated. And then it just stopped for 8 horrific years from 2015. Well, really 2015 to 2019, sort of 4 or 5. Well, yeah. 2021, 2022, I'd say the conflict was largely over. 2019, regardless, for a number of years, the Saudis, the UAE, and the United States utterly failed to dislodge the Houthis from any territory in northern Yemen. The thing about northern Yemen is that's where all the people live. One of the most important dynamics for analyzing conflict is you see a map in the New York Times or the BBC saying, oh, well, the guy we don't like only controls this area. This was very important from Syria, where if you looked at a map of Syria provided by the BBC, the New York Times, circa 2014, it looked like Bashar Assad in Syria only controlled like a few tiny enclaves, a sort of rim of the country close to the sea, and then you look at a map of Syria and where the deserts are, and you realize that Assad, throughout the entirety of the conflict, controlled most of the places where anybody lived. And that's sort of the same case with the conflict in Yemen. On the map that the BBC or the New York Times might provide, it looks like the internationally approved government set up by the Gulf monarchies, controls most of Yemen until you look at where the people live. The Houthis have at no point during this conflict have the Yemenis controlled less than 60 or 70% of the Yemeni population. It's difficult to get real concrete numbers on this, obviously. Much of the country is displaced, what have you, but the Yemenis could control as much of 80% of Yemen's population, and they certainly control most of the useful land in Yemen. So the Yemenis are not some Iranian-backed militia group that it would be easy to target and wipe away. They are the government of Yemen. They control the capital city. They have since 2014. The Saudis undertook a merciless bombing campaign against the Houthis. The UAE has funded supposedly quite competent militia groups within Yemen, funded and armed them, and they have utterly failed to dislodge the Houthis, to the point at which the news out of Yemen that I've been talking about, you can see a podcast, Hope for Yemen, from about 6 months back. The fact that the Saudis were giving up, and the Saudis were looking for a way to end their invasion, looking for a way to make a deal with the Houthis. The Saudis had essentially said, "Fine, you're good." Also, just one thing, the folks who tried to pretend that the southern rump of Yemen was the home of the internationally recognized government were always wrong. We're always full of it. But they did have a veneer of legalistic legitimacy up until 2022. There was Hadi, who was sort of the last barely elected president of Yemen, had resigned and fled the country, spent the entire conflict living in Riyadh, the capital of Saudi Arabia. But according to a UN resolution that Barack Obama essentially gave to the Saudis, he was the real government of Yemen, despite the fact that he hasn't been elected to anything. He's never been elected in a competitive election and hasn't been elected to anything in a decade, and had resigned. The Saudis sort of kept him propped up as oh no, this is the real president of Yemen. They fired him in 2022, and then the Saudis and the UAE handpicked a new, essentially Vichy regime, a new occupation government for southern Yemen. So there's no seriousness or reality to this idea that the southern government of Yemen has any real legitimacy under international law. I think it does actually have some real legitimacy because southern Yemenis just strongly dislike northern Yemenis and strongly resent the essentially invasion-style unification of the country that happened in 1990 and then with a nasty civil war in 1994. So that there is some legitimacy to the Southerners and their control of the South. There is zero legitimacy to the idea that the Presidential Leadership Council is somehow a government of all Yemen. That is utter nonsense and a fiction that, frankly, the Saudis had been giving up on believing. So what's a Houthi? I think is probably a good question to answer. The Houthis, it's a movement that I think would much rather, especially now that they've won their war, would much rather be referred to as the official name of their movement, which I believe is Ansar Allah. They are, but we still call them the Houthis, named after a particular family that remains in charge of the movement. The movement really got started. I mean, it dates back to the 1990s. It was a result, it's a reaction to Saudi colonization of Yemen. Yemen has traditionally been run by a Zaydi Shia leadership. Much is made of the affinities between the Zaydi Shia of Yemen and the different version of Shia of Iran. Those, I think, are customarily pretty exaggerated. But regardless, the traditional leadership of Yemen, probably, again, who knows when there was the last Yemeni census, but I think back of the envelope is that the Zaydi Shia amount to, say, 40% of all of Yemen and probably 52% of northern Yemen, which is another reason why it might just sort of possibly why partition might just make sense. the majority of North Yemen had incredibly resented Saudi influence that was setting up the legendarily intolerant and nasty version of Sunni Islam that Saudi Arabia supports across Yemen. So you had a variety of movements in the 80s and 90s that were organized around, hey, wait a second, this is a Zaidi Shia country that matters, and we resent this Saudi colonization, force feeding us this Wahhabi garbage. One of those political parties, movements, what have you, had some leadership from the Houthi family, and a particular one member of their family was martyred quite spectacularly in a war in 2004, and that began sort of the Houthi movement proper. I believe it's the brother of the guy who was martyred, who's currently sort of running the show. Could be wrong about that. It can be tremendously complicated trying to define what the Houthis are. There's a lot of really easy, simple-minded takes that don't quite capture what's going on in this very tribally oriented culture. Houthis are certainly talking about, I don't know if it'd be fair to call it Zaidi Shia supremacism or what have you, but they are definitely about defending the historic role of Zaidi Shiism in Yemen, but it's also very much about the way that a very favor-based sort of more traditional tribal society has functioned, and how bad a job first Ali Abdullah Saleh, the strongman in charge of Yemen from 1979 until 2012, and then the Saudis and the US have done crushing the Houthi movement. There are members of the Houthi movement that are not Zaidi Shia, because the way, or have been at earlier times, that may be fading away. But what happened from 2004 to 2009 is there was a series of 6 or 7 wars where Yemen's strongman at the time, Ali Abdullah Saleh, went up to the north of Yemen to crush the Houthis, and managed to be so brutal and stupid that he created allies for the Houthis every time he did so. He did this with the support of the Saudis, who really don't like a stridently Zaidi Shia movement becoming more and more powerful on their border. And then in 2009, he'd screwed up so badly, and the Houthis had taken so much more territory, had advanced their cause with every war, that the Saudis in 2009 started bombing Yemen on behalf of the strongman of Yemen. There are other dynamics that really have contributed to the incredible weakness and poverty of Yemen and the Yemeni government that can also be laid at the door of the Saudis and the Americans. The Yemenis, despite having a really, I've done videos on this, despite having a really, what's the word I'm looking for here, tempestuous and unstable set of governments. The 2 presidents before Saleh were assassinated in quick succession, and that was the expectation of what would happen to him as well. But despite all that, the people of Yemen actually had a pretty good 1970s and 1980s. That's an era when most of the developed world was really suffering heavily. But because the Yemenis were so entwined with Saudi Arabia, the petrostate of petrostates, the 1973 oil crisis actually kind of worked for Yemen, and they were doing okay until what is known as the First Gulf War, and probably shouldn't. Yemen had the misfortune of occupying a seat on the Security Council at the point at which Saddam Hussein of Iraq was being condemned for his invasion of Kuwait. There were a number of votes. I think Yemen tried to be cute and abstain here and there, or vote against this or that here and there. And the Saudi and US governments just destroyed the Yemeni economy. Basically, I think kicked out 1 million people from Saudi Arabia and forced them back into Yemen, just sort of transforming it would be like what would happen if the United States really kicked out every single Mexican. And it just had a catastrophic effect on Yemen that the country really hasn't recovered from 30 years later. The war on terror has also been really crap. Ali Abdullah Saleh, the same strongman from 1979 to 2012, managed to use, 10 years later, managed to use the attacks of 9/11 to weasel his way back into the affections of the United States. And this, one of the great virtues of Yemen falling apart economically is that perhaps this incredibly selfish strongman would have failed. Instead, he was saved by the United States and massive counterterrorism funding. To make things even worse, after the underwear bomber, who was reputed to have been outfitted in Yemen, the United States really stepped up its bombing campaign in Yemen. So we were supporting a strongman who was demonstrably a failure, while also massively bombing Yemen. And we are surprised that it ended up falling into civil war just 3 or 4 years later. So yeah, it's a pretty grim situation, all told, that the United States has a very high measure of responsibility for. And it's just, the Houthis were a creation of U.S. and Saudi missteps. There's no question of that in my mind, and it is fascinating and a little horrifying that it is now that group that is providing the threats that the United States needs to double down on its presence in the Middle East. I've been quite incensed and quite angrily emphasizing that despite what folks have said, we have in no way withdrawn from the Middle East. We withdrew from Afghanistan, a country in Central Asia. We have continued to have 50 to 60,000 U.S. troops and sort of Defense Department civilians operating incredibly complex and expensive bases in Bahrain, Qatar, Kuwait, a little more tenuously in Saudi Arabia and the UAE. And now we've got a justification for all of that, thanks to the Houthis that U.S. and Saudi aggression created. And yeah, it's just not a great situation. Will this work? I don't think it will work. I don't think Israel's going to stop doing what it's doing. It is an added detail. I think that the U.S. government is finally beginning to feel some pressure, and this shutting down of the Red Sea might have contributed to that, but it's pretty tangential. It's pretty second order. And the risks for Yemen are just so goddamn high. I think all of Yemen, really, the Presidential Leadership Council in the south and the Houthis benefit from war. That's sort of the really frustrating thing here, is that especially a war of this nature, where there's just billions of dollars spilling out of Gulf monarchy coffers, it becomes profitable to run the smuggling routes. It becomes profitable, and that's a way that the Gulf monarchies are sort of involuntarily supporting the Houthis, because they control most of the places in Yemen where people live. Selling the arms becomes profitable. Managing refugees becomes profitable. There's so many actors in Yemen that really benefit from the continuation of war, and that's what the Houthis are doing here. That is sure, it's an anti-genocide action. Sure, there's humanitarian aspects to what the Houthis are doing here. But fundamentally what they're doing is acting to keep the war going. And honestly, I think that the UAE and Saudi proxies in the Presidential Leadership Council in the South also benefit from this, are also kind of excited that this is happening, because the dynamic over the past couple of years was Saudi Arabia giving up, Saudi Arabia talking to the Houthis, Saudi Arabia willing to back down and go for peace. And the Houthis were like, well, if we do that, then all of these people who just support us to defend them from Saudi bombing might peel off. So they are doing what they can. This may even be their goal, to bring large-scale U.S. bombing to Yemen. And they may get it. And I think that this has the very real possibility of restarting the war in Yemen. And I think that's such an incredible, worthless crime that the Houthis have chosen to commit, with very, very, very little guarantee or even suspicion that it'll have any impact on what's going on in Gaza and tremendously negative impacts in Yemen for the Yemeni war. I think I'm about 40 minutes in. Is that most of what I wanted to say? Presentation-wise, I think that is everything I have. So yeah, there we go. We've got a full hour and a half for questions. Do I think Israel is wrong? Yes. Yes, I do. I think that Israel had retained a position of complete security by October 10th and had the opportunity to utilize incredible goodwill from the world to do a number of things that would have made a lot more sense than the extermination campaign they're currently engaged in. There is no dispute that they have killed 20,000 people. The Israeli figures claim that maybe 1 in 3 of the people they've killed are actual Hamas fighters. They do this, the United States used to do this as well, by simply claiming that every male they kill between the ages of 18 and 65 is a Hamas fighter. So even under those incredibly unfair metrics, 2 out of every 3 people that Israel has killed in Palestine are not, in Gaza, are not actually fighting against them. It is a mass slaughter of civilians, the like of which we have not seen since the initial U.S. shock and awe era of bombing Iraq, which was also an unforgivable crime. There's no, and to be very clear, there's no benefit to Israel, the Israeli public, and what's happening here. The only benefit is prolonging Netanyahu's government, the Netanyahu government that supported and protected Hamas for decades, because that would help keep the two-state solution from happening, and the Netanyahu government that is responsible for the incredible negligence that allowed a bunch of guys with hang gliders and U.S. gun show machine guns to come in and kill 1,200 Israelis. So basically, the only point of the ongoing fighting is to preserve Netanyahu in power, and vitally, this is the most important aspect, keep using U.S. weapons, because there's nothing that the U.S. government cares about more than using U.S. weapons. That's what Ukraine is about. That is what Israel-Gaza is about. That is what Afghanistan was about. That is what the whole war on terror was about. U.S. politicians, U.S. generals get paid when people die. And that's, there's a lot of, I think there's a lot of confusion here about, oh, this is so humiliating for the United States. And it is humiliating for the United States. And it is really gross to be complicit in what I think could probably fairly be described as a genocide. But from the perspective of Washington, D.C., this is just, money, money, money. Oh, man, look, they're using dumb bombs. They're using cluster bombs. They're using white phosphorus. All of this needs to be replaced by somebody. Doesn't matter if the Israelis are going to pay for it. Doesn't matter if the U.S. government's going to pay for it. Does not matter. Everybody's going to get them Nikki Haley jobs as soon as they leave government. Nikki Haley is famously the latest, she's going to beat Trump, who has never worked for anybody other than a defense contractor in the interim of her professional life. That's the goal. That's what most of Washington, D.C. does, is they go and make money from weapons companies. So, yeah, absolutely. Some of the nastiest people in Israel and Israeli government, people mostly created by the U.S. weapons industry, like Netanyahu, are definitely attempting to achieve sort of genocide dreams. But the real reason this is happening, is so people in Washington, D.C. can make money off of these bombs. That's just the world we live in. Quite horrifying. We got questions? Also, I definitely am much more receptive to super chats. I will answer any question that comes with the super chat. What's your opinion on the future of Gaza-Israeli assault and the future of the Palestinian cause? I care about Palestinians. I feel horrible about what's happening to them, but I don't have a particularly positive view of the long-term success of the Palestinian cause. I expected what's been happening in Gaza. I've talked about it in the past. What has surprised me, honestly, is just how little it took for Israel to launch on this what can only be described as a program of extermination. I thought they were going to be under some kind of real threat. I thought there was going to be like a real wider regional war, and under that under that cover, then they would do large-scale Palestinian genocide. The fact that they're doing it because an Israeli prime minister left the door open to a militia that he sponsored and protected for 20 years, that is surprising me. So no, I don't actually, I'm not a big, I mean, I definitely want to go to marches and whatnot to stop what's going on right now, for a ceasefire right now, but I don't have any long-term hope for the Palestinian cause. Sorry if that's depressing, but yeah, I just don't. I just simply I don't. If I were a Palestinian, this is of course absurd to say from the perspective of, a white guy in the United States who's never, whose only ancestral problem is I feel a little guilty about how much we stole. But yeah, if I were a Palestinian, I'd leave, because as bad as this is, what's going to come later on is worse. Also, the Israeli government is doing its best to engineer what's worse. I did a live chat in the first moment talking on October 7th or 8th, talking about the way that this threatened the region and how the chances of a wider regional war were very high. The Houthis are kind of outliers in that they seem to be the only people acting with any Arab solidarity or acting to defend the Palestinians in any way at all. Hezbollah is pretty much backed off. Now, Hezbollah and Israel are exchanging bombings back and forth at a higher pace than they were before October 7th, unquestionably, but this is, I think, described by both actors as sort of a way of maintaining deterrence or sort of increasing deterrence or something like that. And it's been pretty, honestly, a little surprising, not shocking to me, but honestly a little surprising how Iran and Hezbollah have pretty much stayed out of this and been like, well, Hamas, you didn't tell us you were doing this, so this is your problem. It's now becoming clear with more and more leaked communications that the Biden administration is getting really worried that Israel, seeing that the world and even the United States is getting really sick of what they're doing in Gaza, is what they're going to do is they're going to start a war in the north. This was the thing that we were so horrifically concerned about in October. Like, oh no, what if Iran and Hezbollah decide to attack Israel on top of what's going on with Hamas? It now seems likely that Israel will attack Hezbollah and try to draw Iran into it, because Israel wants to create a wider war. And if Israel does create a wider war, then they will have the cover to not just step up their genocide in Gaza. They will also have the ability to, what's the word I'm looking for, ethnically cleanse the West Bank and maybe even start in on the Israeli Arabs. So yeah, it's super dark. But no, I don't have any positive, anything positive to say about the long-term Palestinian cause. I think they lost. And it would be nice if the United States and Israel had the basic humanity to acknowledge that and treat them as people. Instead, they're just being treated as sort of history's losers who should get out. And that's very sad. Star Pulsaro asks, is the Ukraine war being pushed to the sidelines because of the Israel-Hamas war? 100%. 100%. Yeah, no question. I think you can find news reports talking about artillery shells that were meant for Ukraine being diverted to Israel. That's pretty straightforward. The United States has the ability to do all of these things, but there's no question that there's an importance behind maintaining a high level of indignation, maintaining a lot of human rights credibility that we are losing everywhere. It's real freaking hard for anybody, not that we were being particularly successful at it, but it's really hard for anybody in India, China, or Africa to look at what we're doing in Gaza and believe that we're somehow humanitarian sovereignty pals with Ukraine. It's just quite simply, it's not just the money, it's the political will and the political credibility that we're losing with the Gaza massacres. Because honestly, I mean, what's happening in terms of civilian deaths in just 2 months in a country that is a 20th the size of Ukraine, we've absolutely killed more civilians in Gaza than have been killed in Ukraine. There's some dispute over that. The mayor of Mariupol claims that 20,000 civilians were killed in Mariupol, but I think that's a propaganda claim that nobody's really backed up. I think the more official terms for the amount of civilians killed are like 10,000 over the past 2 years of war in Ukraine, a country 20 times larger than Gaza. And I think the very, very conservative estimates are that 20,000 civilians have been killed in Gaza, with the understanding that there's like 10,000 more people that are missing who are almost certainly just buried in rubble. A truly horrific, indefensible nightmare that we are creating. And we will probably be bombing Yemen pretty shortly in defense of the indefensible. So. Abdi Hersi says, if the demands from the Houthis are increased access to food, fuel, and medicine into Gaza, was there a reasonable off-ramp to the U.S. taking this action in the Red Sea? Is the motive in an Iran conflict? I don't think Iran is particularly bothered by what the Houthis are doing, but I also don't think that they actively made it happen either. This is a Houthi choice, and I think that the political reasons why the Houthis are doing it are what I laid out. They are doing it because they want to keep the war going, because their legitimacy is based on being in the resistance. I read a couple books on Hezbollah last year, and it's fascinating that this moment is actually very similar to a choice that Hezbollah made after they had successfully, heroically, kicked Israel out of its 15-year occupation of southern Lebanon. I think most of the world recognized that Hezbollah had done something kind of impressive, and everyone was sort of like, "Oh, well, geez." The problem for Hezbollah was that they were the resistance people, and they'd been resisting Israel, and they instantly lost a lot of credibility when the Israelis left. They instantly lost a lot of power in Lebanese politics. So what they did, I think, to the eternal shame of that movement, they bear some responsibility for everyone Israel killed in Lebanon in 2006. Because after kicking out the Israelis in 2000, they decided to pick a fight over Sheba Farms, which is Israeli-occupied territory, but it's Syrian-occupied territory. And they started kidnapping Israeli soldiers just to keep the fight going after they'd won. And I think that's what the Houthis are doing right now. They're just trying to keep the fight going after winning. And it's really tremendously sad and tremendously risky for Yemen. And it makes me angry and sad. Scott Locke says, enjoyed the Millet Argentine podcast. Thank you. Any thoughts on if the U.S. will continue to play a little role in Latin America outside of possible Republican invasion of Mexico? I just think and I'm trying to write a video on this now, between the flu and trying to follow and prepare live chats on Yemen stuff, Red Sea stuff. The thing is, the U.S. is getting everything it wants out of Argentina. I think it's just so obvious that even Washington, D.C. has to notice that the United States gets what it wants when it steps away. That I'm reading a history of Latin America, and it really is, since the end of the Cold War was one of the worst eras in in Latin American history, because the United States would just come in and fund all kinds of murderous dictators. Really, I was surprised actually that this author wouldn't go 100% with that characterization, but it characterized places like Chile and Argentina and Costa Rica as places that had largely been, or Uruguay, as places that had largely been stable. And had tried, with absolutely some caudillos and this, that, and the other thing, and sort of tried to steadily work their way towards representative democracy, really were crushed by the Cold War. And those are actually the only moments when they had truly nasty dictatorships and massacres and this, that, and the other thing. And I think that's a little unfair, a little too rosy a portrayal of the history of those countries, but it is interesting. So anyway, it's a long way of saying the 30 years since the end, 35 years now, geez, wow, 35 years, because I was alive back then. The 35 years since the end of the Cold War have been miraculous for Latin America. There are so many issues related to crime, continued inequality, stuff like that, but oh my gosh, has it been so much better than the Cold War era. And I would say, not necessarily, not arguably, I would say absolutely has been so much better than any period before the Cold War as well. Real representative democracy seems to be present in most Latin American countries. And I think even the United States has to recognize that when they throw their weight around and try to do coups, as we've seen in not just Venezuela, but also Bolivia recently, we get humiliated. We look like idiots. And end up having to deal with the same socialist government a decade or two later, which is the case in Bolivia and Venezuela. Venezuela, a really crappy socialist government, and Bolivia, this is why you haven't heard about Bolivia so much, an amazingly successful socialist government that we tried to coup in 2019. And then just the contrast with Argentina, where we've got an almost too pro-U.S. politician coming to power, when we just sort of kicked back and didn't do anything. I've got to hope that even in the thick heads of Washington, D.C., it's becoming established that actually Latin America has orderly transitions of power. They'll try left-oriented folks for a while. It'll do good things or bad things. Then they'll try right-oriented folks for a while. That's, regular democracy. Latin America's got it, and I would hope that the United States would let that continue to happen. I do wonder and worry, Scott, about the prospect of a U.S. invasion of Mexico. That is something that every Republican candidate, I believe, including Donald Trump, has said that they wanted. What a terrible fucking idea. And I hope I don't have to make even more videos on that topic, because it's a real bad idea. If you became Israeli Prime Minister on October 8th and had no power to change the past, what would you do to beat Hamas and maintain deterrence against other Iranian proxies? Would pressure in Qatar work? What would I do? I think I would secure the border. It'd be the first thing that I'd do. I would probably I'd probably be bombing Hamas targets and killing a lot of civilians, is what I'd be doing. But as I was doing that, and it's important to remember, I say we because it is us, didn't start the ground invasion until almost a month after, or at least 20 days after the October 7th attacks. I would have continued to kick back in that way. I would have, I think it's important to point out, Qatar, I believe, voluntarily stopped funding Hamas, and the Netanyahu government told them to keep funding them. I think I don't have that at my fingertips, but I'm pretty sure that's how the events went. I think I would have treated, as we all wish the Bush administration had treated 9/11, as a opportunity for cracking down on the funding of Hamas. As a moment where Israel, extraordinarily rare moment for Israel, when they had the sympathy of the world and could have acted to attempt to knit together the Palestinian Authority again. It's this absurd notion that we're going to somehow conquer Gaza and then we're going to install the Palestinian Authority, the West Bank government there. No, that's absolutely ridiculous. I would say that there was a vastly higher chance of some kind of Fatah or Palestinian Authority taking over of Gaza before the Israeli invasion. Now, I think because of the Israeli invasion, there's a distinct chance, and the genocidaires in the Israeli government, I'm not saying all Israeli government figures are genocidaires, I'm saying the genocidaires, and they are there, that are currently in the Israeli government would love nothing more than for Hamas to take over the West Bank, and that's what their attack on Gaza, their merciless attack on Gaza, is most likely to bring about. Hamas's popularity is skyrocketing in Gaza and the West Bank because of the obscene mass murder of Palestinians that is being carried out. October 7th was horrible. Every day since has been an example of absolutely horrific Israeli government crimes. Because people are stupid, the Israeli public largely supports this war, and they are fucking stupid. Just as the Palestinian public now more and more supports Hamas because they are fucking stupid. Because in the aftermath of 9/11, all I wanted was blood, so I supported Bush's invasion of Iraq because I was fucking stupid. As humans, we should get better than this, and we should stop creating situations that make people fucking stupid, if that makes any sense. What are your thoughts on Robert Kennedy Jr. being president? He's not going to be president. That's my thought. I think Robert Kennedy Jr. sounds and looks, not sounds like, you're like, oh, he's a Kennedy. And then you look into what he believes and has fought for, and you're like, he's a big Zionist, by the way, which is, not particularly attractive to anti-establishment types. He's, Zionist, he's anti-vax. There's a lot of reasons to not take him seriously, but you look at a picture of him and you're like, oh, wow, he's got that sort of Kennedy gravitas. And then you hear him talk and he's got this weird fucking gravelly voice. I think he'd be pretty easy to disqualify. I mean, I don't know. Of course, against Trump and Biden, who knows? Anything's possible. I have no expectation of Robert F. Kennedy Jr. being president. Let's see. Do we have a question? The moral of the story is don't be fucking stupid. Yes, it is. Could Israel actually collapse like Rhodesia? No. Just no. I think there's a lot of... I did a video saying Israel is not South Africa, and I think some people comment on that thinking I'm saying that Israel's not an apartheid state. Of course Israel is an apartheid state, like the definition of an apartheid state. But Israel is not South Africa in that the Israelis are massively more powerful and more in control of the joint Israeli-Palestinian state than the South African folks were at the end. And I don't see any real chance of Israel falling in any serious way. I think it's just, we're just going to see continued, particularly vicious consolidation, I think is what we're going to see and what we're going to get. Will world opinion affect any decisions for Palestinian cause? Yes, absolutely. I think it is wearing on the Biden administration. It is wearing, it's this horrific thing that, international opinion only matters insofar as it can change U.S. government decisions. I mean, that's life in the U.S. empire. And I do think that enough of the U.S. public is becoming aware that what is happening there is so horrific and so insane. And that, of course, is why the Israeli government is trying to start a war with Lebanon, with Hezbollah and Iran right now, or at least seriously considering it. Because in that context, then the U.S. public doesn't care anymore. The U.S. public is like, oh, well, okay, we're just going to defend Israel no matter what. But it does absolutely matter. It does absolutely matter. International opinion matters because it influences U.S. opinion, which definitely matters and will eventually impact the U.S. government. Questions. Let's see. Palestinians want the destruction end of Israel. You get that, right? No, not necessarily. Palestinians want their own state. When Israel is acting to destroy and murder Palestinians at scale, which it has done really every 5 years for the past 2 decades, then Palestinians hate Israel. You can find the polling going back to those brief moments 20, 25 years ago when it looked like a two-state solution was possible, and then the percentage of Palestinians who wanted to exterminate Israel was down in like the 10s or 20% range or something like that. It has not been possible since Ariel Sharon was in power. And as the Israelis, again, every 4 or 5 years, there's a mass killing by Israelis of Palestinians. And October 7th was the first point since the Second Intifada that I think wrapped up around, what, 2003, 2004? It was the first point in 20 years or 18 years that any Israelis had died at all. So every 5 years, every 5 years, the Israelis would just do a mass killing. Like, was it 2018, the sort of March of Return or whatnot, where Israeli snipers just murdered 1,000, 1,500 folks who were peacefully marching towards the border with Israel, and crippled thousands more. What kind of Palestinian would you be if you were like, yeah, I like these guys? And the extraordinary thing is there are activists who, are still on the Palestinian side committed towards peace and this, that, and the other thing. And if there were any, the leadership of Israel for the past 20 years, Netanyahu came out and said it. He came out and said it a couple weeks, over the past week, Netanyahu came out and said, yes, I killed the two-state solution. That's what I wanted to do. That's what I've talked about. I did it. I killed it. You've been blaming me for it, and that's exactly what I did. Palestinians, blaming the Palestinians for this situation is just morally vacant. You're just putting up a flag saying, I'm a fool. I don't know anything about history, and I have no moral basis here. To be clear, I don't think the Palestinians are going to win. I think the Palestinians have lost already. But you have to be really historically ignorant to believe that it's somehow the Palestinians that were the problem here, the Palestinians that wasted opportunities. It's just that's simply not the case. That's just not the history. I would urge you to read a little more if that's what you think. And read something by a Palestinian or like a European, not a American or an Israeli. Not that there aren't great works by Israelis who point to quite honestly what's been happening. But you're less likely to get honesty from an Israeli or a U.S. citizen than you are from a European or a Palestinian. Brando Commando says, long time no see, Rob. I wish I could donate, but I'm a broke college student. All I can do is tune in, unfortunately. Well, I'm happy you're here, Brando Commando. Would a secular, multi-ethnic, single state solve all of these problems? It seems like it would to me. The problem is it's just not going to happen at this point. It is impossible. The Israelis have done everything to make things worse. They have sabotaged the two-state solution, but they're not wrong in saying that a one-state solution is not viable, and there would be much broader violence. I think of Indian partition. I think again the Israelis would win that violence. That actually might be something, we're going to do a one-state solution, and then you just have horrific 1947 Indian partition type violence, and it's one state with a bunch of dead Palestinians. I don't think either the Israeli or the Palestinian side would accept a secular multi-ethnic single state at this point. I think unfortunately I think unfortunately there's going to be population transfers, large scale, much larger scale massacres is the future that I see. What would a hypothetical future look like if the U.S. was no longer pro-Israel? Will India or China step up? India already is very pro-Israel. China could want to be. But I don't see any future where the U.S. isn't pro-Israel. I think I could see a future where the U.S. acts with a little more restraint, stops co-signing all the horrible things that, if you want to talk about how to slow down what I kind of believe is an inevitable Palestinian genocide, the United States stepping back from supporting Israel is the way to do it. We're never going to step back from supporting Israel to the extent of we're going to let Israel fall. That's just simply not what we're going to do. But we really don't have to continue. We really just should not continue to support this genocide to the extent that we do. The genocide will be slower if the U.S. stops giving Israel such a blank check. It'll happen anyway. But yeah. Logo Cool Stream asks the very good question: what's up with the "River to the Sea" chant and people pretending it's genocidal? It absolutely nuts. That absolutely freaking nuts. That it's even gotten worse than that. We had a fucking Republican congressman, Elise Stefanik, really, truly nasty individual, getting university presidents to insist that calling for an intifada is genocidal, which is absolute nonsense. It's an uprising. It is, it's so much like a war on terror or whatnot. It is policing of language. It is absurd, ahistorical, deeply ignorant garbage that is being fed to senile baby boomers to keep them desperate, in a desperate attempt to keep them from doing the basic math of what's happening with this ongoing extermination. And yeah, if you can create enough bullshit about U.S. politics and universities that everybody in the United States hates, it's just an attempt to keep people from looking at the extermination that's happening. It's just a delaying. It's just a what's the word I'm looking for? It's just a just an attempt to distract, and I have very little respect for it. It's what was the? Oh, there was some recent story that I wanted to mention, but I've forgotten it. I'm sorry. Yeah. Oh, yeah. So Harvard has actually, and this is something you can see across think tanks and across universities. This is a really great example. Brookings Institution has people who do incredible research, incredible work. Harvard University has people who do incredible research, incredible work. What matters is who from those institutions gets invited to speak on television, who from those institutions gets invited to sit on committees talking about anti-Semitism. My understanding is that Harvard has a guy who's like the world authority on anti-Semitism, the history of Israel-Palestine, what have you. And then when it came time to put together Harvard's committee for the rich donors, to investigate anti-Semitism at Harvard, he was not asked. He was not even consulted. So Harvard has world-leading experts on the history of Israel and Palestine, the nature of anti-Semitism, the connection between these dynamics in U.S. politics, and none of them are being invited to participate in these committees to investigate anti-Semitism. It's all a bunch of rich dum-dums and IPAC-approved politicians. It's not a serious endeavor. It's not something that actually anybody wants to look at seriously. It's just an excuse. How would Saudi Arabia's westernization impact the United States? It doesn't really matter at this point. I argued with the beginning of the first Abraham Accords. That was like the moment where maybe Nasser died or Nasser lost his third war against Israel or something like that. That point in the 1970s where most of the Arab public realized that old school Arab nationalism and pan-Arabism was not going to do it for them. And what happened in the 1970s and the 1980s was more Saudi-style, hyper, Saudi-style, Muslim Brotherhood style, just like hyper politicization of extreme Islam became the focus in sort of the 70s, 80s. I would argue that with the Abraham Accords and the UAE and Saudi Arabia's complete abandonment of the Palestinian cause and complete kowtowing to Israel and the United States, that sort of era of Saudi UAE influence ended. Like it's just done now. It's not like a real thing. So yeah, it's good that the Saudis do legitimately seem to be stepping back from supporting, things like 9/11, which they were the main country behind, and supporting Islamic extremism all over the world. It's good that they're stepping back from that, and that's good. But it's sort of, the period of history where Saudi Arabia had tremendous influence on world Islam and the course of events in the Middle East is already ending, and will will be over within the next 7 years or so, as I've said. Um, Hey Rob, I'm about 30 behind live. Just had a question comment. Don't you think the mass siege starvation of Yemen, hundreds of thousands were at risk of starvation, strikes a nerve with the Houthis? Absolutely. I'm sure that the Houthis see the very real parallels. They're both U.S. government supported and U.S. government supported and continued. I absolutely believe that the Houthis see an affinity with what was done to them over the past decade and what's been done to Gaza. However, I do think that we should not fall into. So yes, I 100% agree, but the possibility. But I think it's important to emphasize that what is happening in Gaza and what has been happening over the past 2 months is significantly worse than what the Saudis did to Yemen. And I say that as somebody who has made like 20 videos condemning Saudi Arabia for what it was doing to Yemen. Like, it is significantly worse. It is significantly worse because of the pace of destruction. I think all told, over 5 or 6 years, like the number of people that were directly killed by Saudi munitions was something like 30,000, maybe even less than that. Horrific, terrible war crimes. They blew up school buses. But Israel's already surpassed that. The official numbers are that 20,000 have been killed, but there's another 10,000 missing that are almost certainly dead and buried in rubble. So in 2 months, the Israelis have already killed more Gazans. This is a country that is a 15th the size of Yemen. Have already killed, in raw terms, not proportionally, in raw terms, have already killed more Gazans than the Saudis killed directly. However, there is like the Saudi actions to blockade the country, as you point out, did kill likely hundreds of thousands of Yemenis. But that's something that takes time. That's something, it takes months to starve somebody to death. It takes months to degrade infrastructure to the extent that something like that can happen. And that's what Israel's doing. Like, that's what Israel's doing to Gaza right now, and we won't even begin to see. Like, I think it's entirely possible that we'll have 100,000 dead Gazans by November 2024. Genocide Joe is going to have to answer for that. Entirely possible to have 100,000 or hundreds of thousands. This is, again, out of a population of 2 million. So yeah, I just want to emphasize again that, like, it is not. There are aspects of what Israel is doing in Gaza that are comparable to the worst crimes of this century: Yemen, Syria, the Congo, Ethiopia, Sudan. But on almost every measure, what's going on in Israel and Gaza is so much worse. So yeah. Let's see. Scott Locke says, Guyana expects to reach 1 million barrels a day in the coming years. Why is the U.S. being so restrained on Venezuelan threats? That's a great, it's funny. I love when someone frames a question that actually makes me think about it in different ways. And I think one interpretation that matches sort of some of my more tinfoil hat approaches, I don't think it's tinfoil hat approaches. I think it's something that the U.S. is actually doing, whether or not it recognizes it. And that it is that the United States is all about shutting down other oil production. The countries that we've had the biggest flare-ups against over the past 20 years, Iraq, Iran, and Russia, are all, and Venezuela, are all oil and gas producers. At the exact same time as the United States has become a massive oil and gas exporter again. Libya, we also destroyed Libya. And I think at a certain point, you've got to look at all this and say, maybe that's not a coincidence. I'm not saying that there's some, cabal of Exxon, elders of Zion or something sitting in Washington, D.C. going, ha, 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 which oil and gas place are we going to take out next? But it's definitely a part of the calculus, the fact that places are more likely to be taken out. So the way you worded that question, Scott, like maybe we'd be okay if Venezuela invaded Guyana and took out one of the newest, biggest competitors to Texas oil and gas. I don't think that's true. I think that's a little too paranoid. I think that the United States has an abiding interest in war with Venezuela, and it's entirely possible that we want to draw Venezuela into, by not making such a big deal about it, we want to draw Venezuela into making such an attack. Because then that would finally give us an excuse to destroy the Venezuelan military and attempt to assassinate Maduro in a more serious way than a bunch of mercenaries in a Zodiac. So those are two plausible answers. I think the U.S. is actually, this is a case where I think the United States has, to a degree, begrudgingly done the right thing. There was a referendum in Venezuela where I guess the public endorsed the idea that Venezuela was going to go and take half of Guyana. And the United States responded by sending a bunch of U.S. Planes to Guyana, right? For some kind of joint exercise or something along those lines. I think Maduro would be insane to actually attempt to invade Guyana. I think the United States would utterly destroy his military in response, and I would not actually object to that. As a guy who is very strongly against any kind of U.S. intervention, if we are reinforcing the principle that countries should not invade their neighbors, I think it is worth. So I just don't think Maduro will be stupid enough to do that. I think there was already some kind of meeting facilitated to some extent by the Brazilians, is my understanding. Yeah, and I think Venezuela realizes that Maduro would realize that he'd lose so many natural friends. Lula, sort of reinstated left-wing government of Brazil, would be incensed if he were to do that. So I think there's already been, to some degree, backing down by Venezuela. But we'll see. Dumber things have happened. But those are two plausible reasons, Scott, why perhaps the United States might be not being as voluble about it. And I think there is I think that people can overstate the United States has gone through overreach and we're committed in too many places. I really don't think that's true. I really don't think that if the United States could move a few things around and could support Ukraine indefinitely, could support Israel's extermination plan inevitably, and could also probably maintain a larger war over Taiwan if we just nationalized the defense contractor or two. We're nowhere near at the beginning of people are like, oh yeah, the U.S. is overtaxed and is over. We're definitely not overtaxed, but the U.S. is overcommitted and this, that, and the other thing. We have become overcommitted over a course of asking nothing from the U.S. taxpayer, nothing from U.S. defense contractors. That's a really important one. Nothing from U.S. defense contractors. Most of this money, the money that goes to Ukraine, certainly the money that went to Afghanistan, is mostly just recycled within the United States. If the United States was at all serious about any of these conflicts other than as a way to spend money, we could totally do everything and more. But I do think that the way to more efficiently fight wars in the world at this point, because there are enough things that we're doing right now, the only way to more efficiently fight wars from the U.S. perspective is to start cutting into defense industry profits, start using the Defense Production Act, start using many U.S. laws that have been atrophied and just ignored for decades, to simply say to defense contractors, no, you're not going to be able to profit to that extent anymore. And I think that is what we're not up against any kind of real constraints on U.S. military activity. We're up against real constraints on the profits of U.S. defense companies. We've continued to ask nothing and give everything to U.S. defense companies. And in the context of asking nothing from and giving everything to U.S. defense companies, their shareholders, and the Congress they bought, in that context, yeah, we are overstretched. Yeah, we can. I think we have reached a certain point where it's just, Jesus, another effing thing? I think in the context of making all of these companies obscenely rich in Israel and Ukraine and Taiwan, the sort of military industrial complex is geez, now we have to do the Red Sea and Venezuela too? there's no question of the U.S. being legitimately limited from being able to do that. It's a question of, can we preserve the level of obscene corruption that we've allowed in the defense sector and allow that to continue? That's more the question. So, and rest assured, every foreign policy practitioner, Republican and Democrat, you've seen or heard from over the past 2 decades is 100% invested in the incredibly corrupt system of defense procurement in the United States. So yeah, like, get very worried about the United States actually ever feeling legitimately threatened in the slightest, because a lot of very wealthy people in the United States will lose out very quickly, and the United States will become, I know this is hard to imagine, much, much more violent, powerful, and intimidating. It's not a situation anyone in the world wants. Trust me. Questions. Loga asks, what do you think of the argument made by pro-Israelis that the majority of deaths of minors are teenage boys who were recruited as soldiers? I think it's fucking nonsense. I think the idea that, no, I mean, they are pancaking apartment complexes. This is not a question of, I mean, sure, I'm sure there are plenty of 14, 15, 16-year-olds who have taken up arms for Hamas. I'd like to think I would, but if I were a Palestinian. But the idea that you can just say the majority of deaths of minors are teenagers, that's just simply not true. It's simple that if you dive into the numbers at all, you'll see that most of the people being killed are women and children. James Parker, in the past, Gaza was spared from the worst of secondary deaths, thanks largely to you. That's a very good point from James Parker. In the past, Gaza was spared from the worst of secondary deaths. That's how Yemen became a humanitarian crisis. That's how, I think they put 400,000 on the number of people killed. That's like secondary deaths. That is starvation. That is disease. That is what's starting in Gaza right now. Just barely beginning in Gaza right now. So in the past, Gaza was spared from the worst of secondary deaths thanks largely to UNWAR, which is better funded than most UN agencies. But this time I don't see them being able to stop it. Too much. Too much of Gaza is rubble. Yeah. The United States is finally making it more of an emphasis that humanitarian goods make it into Gaza, that there be humanitarian provision in Gaza, but it's a trickle. It's a trickle. Yeah, there was, when 400,000 people died in Gaza over the past decade, in Yemen over the past decade, at no point was the United Nations not on the ground to some extent and feeding people to some extent. It's just that in the context of an ongoing war zone, there will be mass death. And Israel is committed to maintaining it. See, that's the thing, like, Israel will, I think the next step, this has been well telegraphed, is when the United States finally tells Israel that it has to stop this level of slaughter, it will stop this level of slaughter, and it will occupy along the lines that it has. It will continue more targeted bombings against Hamas, and it will allow a little bit of just enough humanitarian goods in to keep it from, to keep more than 10,000 people from dying a month. But they'll maintain it at, thousands of people dying every month and convincing people that they have to move to Egypt. Real grim. Real grim. Oh, this is Banana Palm says, well, Rob, what's happening in Gaza is sad. Not really, but Arabs need to pay for their centuries of colonization of Africa. Look at what's been happening in Sudan for such horse shit. That is such horse shit. And it's just such, like, collective punishment. The stupidity of that comment. What a number of Arab tribesmen are doing in Darfur is really gross. But the idea that, like, some kind of historical guilt or attaches to an entire diverse Arab people, that somehow the Palestinians should be victims for things that the modern or historic Arab populations have done, it's fucking nonsense. And if there's some kind of real historical justice or consequences for colonization and destruction, like, you're essentially calling for my death. as a comfortably off white American guy. So is that what you're calling for, Banana Palm? Are you calling for the extermination of Americans? Because that's pretty gross. The Arabs need to pay one way or the other. It's such nonsense. Just offensive. Bigoted nonsense from Banana Palm. But you're more than welcome to participate and provide that bigoted nonsense. Because we are very pro-free speech here. Yeah, Banana Palm apparently wants to exterminate Europe and the United States, which is really, really unpleasant. That's a lie to justification. What is this? What are the questions? Yeah, where are these comments? Yeah, I should answer a TikTok question. Does anybody want to give me a TikTok question? No, we're just no questions on TikTok, huh? All right. Let's see. Where's the questions? Where are the questions? Lyra asks, what do you think about UNRWA's role in the conflict? Apart from aid and education, did they really help Palestinian refugees by having them inherit their refugee status? Is right of return just? I think right of return is sort of a silly fantasy. I think it's just not something that's going to exist. I've always thought that. But again, like harping on the right of return as if it's some nasty, terrible thing that the Palestinians did. It's like the Palestinians have no power, have had no power. They didn't have any power before 1948. They have no power. So sort of quibbling about details of negotiation points that the Palestinians had before the Israelis went and elected Ariel Sharon, who was dedicated to crushing any idea of a two-state solution, just seems like it's sort of absurd victim blaming to me at this point. It's a lot like saying like, gosh, those Indians at the Trail of Tears really were committed to their communal ownership of land, and that was ridiculous. I mean, obviously that wasn't going to work. Why would they be committed to their communal ownership of land? So obviously the Trail of Tears was totally justified. That's whenever I read something about like, Palestinian education, UNRWA, da, 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 like it doesn't really impress me much, Lior. Let's see. Who doesn't think the right of return is not just? I don't think the right of return is just. I think that there's a lot of different ways you can define the right of return, but the idea that large-scale Palestinian refugee communities can return to Israel is fundamentally ridiculous. Perhaps I'm not defining the right of return appropriately. It's just simply not going to happen. Could large-scale Palestinian populations return to an independent Palestinian state in West Bank and Gaza? I think that's much more interesting and much more plausible. But I don't think that's what they're talking about with the right of return. They're talking about like individual Israelis getting their villages. Individual Palestinians getting their villages outside of Tel Aviv back, and that's never going to happen. That was never going to happen. So yeah, I don't invest much in impossible concepts. I mean, that said, like, I think that most settlements in the West Bank should be wiped out. That's something that should obviously happen. I think that 1967 lines, any Israeli settlement outside of that should be wiped out. That's not going to happen. And when I say wiped out, I mean they should move back to Tel Aviv or Brooklyn. I don't mean any kind of violence. But also that's never going to happen. So yeah, the right of return is just, it's been harped on by a lot of people like, oh, look at how the only reason right of return exists, not the only reason, but like the only reason we hear about right of return is because it's a useful, because a lot of Palestinian leadership is connected to the concept in, for whatever reason, but also it's brought up a lot by Zionists to talk about the fundamentally unreasonable nature of Palestinian demands. So that's why we hear about it. I mean, it's not a legitimate I mean, it's just a silly concept. Rob, what are the best ways to get rich in America? What are the best ways to get rich in America? Inherit. Highly recommend inheriting. That's the best way to get rich in America. That is now actually the way that most billionaires are made, is through inheritance. Now, very few are self-made anymore. Real estate is pretty consistently a winner. There's so many risks involved in it, but man, like you just haven't stopped winning if you're big into real estate investing. It's a great place to be, but also very risky. But I do think getting involved in real estate is probably, like, if you really truly were to, like, come to the United States. But the problem is now, because so much about the United States is inherited wealth, real estate's a lot harder to get into. Like, there are a lot of parts in the country where 20 years ago you could buy a house for $70,000, which means that you could put a mortgage on that, with like $5,000 to $10,000 down, which conceivably is money that you could make. As a young person with no health costs or no responsibilities, you could conceivably make that money, working at a restaurant or something along those lines. That avenue is closed. So yeah, real estate was a real way to make money in the United States, but I don't know that that's really available to anyone without family resources anymore. So yeah, the best way to get rich in America is inherit it, and then through hard work and diligence you can go from a minorly rich person to a majorly rich person. That is the current best way to get rich in America. I think real estate has been the historic pathway to generational wealth. And I think that we have, in part because it's such an important pathway to generational wealth, we have closed down their the ability for new entrants to come into it. So we need to figure out a way to build enough housing, and this is also impossible. So you build enough housing so that people who are not generationally already on it can get on the housing ladder, without dramatically lowering the wealth of the 60% of Americans whose wealth is completely wrapped up in the price of that asset. So yeah, it's a delightful little catch-22 we've constructed over the past 70 years in the United States, and we should probably figure out what to do about it. M. Harry 24 asks, why is Israel escalating in the West Bank? Why is Israel escalating in the West Bank? USS Liberty. There's actually somebody on TikTok with the title USS Liberty, which is funny. I'd asked him if they'd ever heard of the USS Stark. USS Liberty is a famous anti-Semitic bugaboo because during, I believe, the Six-Day War, the Israelis blew up a U.S. ship inadvertently. But actually, Saddam Hussein, while we were defending him from the Iranians, actually, as we launched the war against the Iranians on his behalf in the late 80s, did the exact same thing, the USS Stark. So why do you care so much about the USS Liberty, but not the USS Stark? It's really hard for me to come up with an answer other than anti-Semitism, but there you go. Let's see here. And it's fascinating to see USS Liberty, a name that's really associated with anti-Semitism, talking about some massive support for Zelensky, talking about how Yanukovych killed everyone in Maidan Square, which has never been established. Anyway, it's fascinating. Let's go back to the questions that people are paying for. M. Harry 24, why is Israel escalating in the West Bank? Because this Israeli government, and I think it is important to emphasize that it is this Israeli government with a incredibly dubious electoral legitimacy, is openly genocidal. That's what Netanyahu is like the soft edge of this Israeli government. The guys who are in charge in the West Bank are the hyper right-wing guys he had to ally with to become prime minister again. So this Israeli government, it's not Israel in general, but this Israeli government is escalating in the West Bank because this Israeli government is filled with people with openly genocidal intent. They are hoping for a intifada, a mass armed uprising in the West Bank that would justify the kinds of mass killings in the West Bank that they are doing in Gaza. That's why Israel's escalating in the West Bank. That's why, oh gosh, why aren't people, why don't you condemn Hamas, and why aren't Palestinians all about Fatah and the Palestinian Authority is like, it all seems rather ridiculous to me. So yeah, Israel is escalating in the West Bank because it wants to do what it's doing to Gaza to the West Bank. And that's not all Israelis, that's this Israeli government that somehow, some way has remained in power for almost 3 months now after the obscenity that they allowed on October 7th. Abdi Hirsi asks, if push comes to shove for Egypt, do they have any way of avoiding the forced transfer to Sinai? News came out today that they were working with the U.S. to avoid that. Is it BS? No. The United States really does not want the Egyptian government to fall. So no, that's not BS. Absolutely, Israel would already be doing mass transfers of Gazans to the Sinai Desert. Sort of a mini Armenian genocide at this point, if it weren't for the Biden administration stopping that. But the U.S. cares more about selling weapons than it does about stopping this openly genocidal Israeli government. And Netanyahu is a great weapons guy. Non-stop bombs. That's what the U.S. government cares about the most. But absolutely, the U.S. government does not want the Sisi government to fall. And I think the Biden administration, dumb as it is, does recognize that if there were large-scale transfers of Gazans to the Sinai Desert, temporarily as a permanent temp-to-perm action by the Israeli government, the Egyptian government would fall, and the chaos that would result. I mean, that level of chaos, I don't think even this incredibly irresponsible Israeli government wants, because that would be very, very bad for Israel if this Egyptian government fell. Especially in the context of the ongoing extermination program in Gaza. So yeah, that is my thoughts on that. Let's see. Was there not a major cover-up of the USS Liberty? Can you debunk that rather than just calling it anti-Semitic, which means anti-Arab? Oh, good Lord. Look, so the USS Liberty is, I've already debunked it. So the USS Liberty is a U.S. military vessel that received friendly fire from the Israeli government during, I believe, the Six-Day War, right? And the Israelis screwed up and shot the naval vessel of the country that was helping them at that point. To jump to any kind of conspiracy theory, there's two things you have to do. Like anything from there to say beyond a mistake, you've got to come up with a really good persuasive reasoning why it wasn't a mistake. And nobody has ever provided that to me. The other way to say that, like, to put in someone's mind that, like, oh, no, this definitely wasn't a mistake. This is definitely intentional because this sort of thing never happens. Friendly fire never happens. Well, I've given you an example of the USS Stark when we were absolutely saving Saddam Hussein's ass in 1987, 1988. He attacked and killed 37 sailors on the USS Stark, and we actually used that as the motivating jumping off point for us to defend him and sink the entire Iranian Navy. At that point, Iran and Iraq were in a 10-year war. So there you go. Like, to believe the USS Liberty is some kind of nasty, sinister thing, you have to believe that this sort of thing just never happens. It's crazy that somebody would mistakenly fire on the ship of their ally. There must be some lengthy explanation, some weird thing about Jewish evil that led to the USS Liberty. That must be what it's about. But here's an example from 20 years later of the Iraqis doing the exact same thing. And there are no plausible, and you never hear about it. You never hear about it in part because if people mention that and that was more common knowledge, it would be impossible to make the USS Liberty sound like a bad thing. There is a simple fact of military material and military action that friendly fire happens, that you, in the fog of war, especially in the 1960s, you have no idea what is actually going on. You are in war and you fire at things that look threatening. I've seen nothing at all persuasive that the USS Liberty was intentional by the Israeli government other than bigotry and ignorance of just how much friendly fire happens in military contexts. Pat Tillman was a great American hero. He gave up a football contract to go fight in Afghanistan. And my understanding is it's been pretty well established. He was killed by, not intentionally, he was killed unintentionally by U.S. fire. It's just something that happens in war. And to fixate on the USS Liberty, one example here, I'd have to see a lot more evidence, any evidence at all, to believe that this is somehow a real thing that Israel intentionally did to the United States, its main supporter. Like, what is even the story there that you're supposed to believe? So yeah, if I see somebody who prop up in my comments saying USS Liberty, I'm just like, oh, you're an anti-Semite. You really just, or you're just deeply, deeply misled. So yeah, I think harping on USS Liberty for me is a pretty quick disqualifier for anybody who's making a comment. And maybe that's, I mean, thank you, Narrative Observer. You've actually made a rather large gift to get a rather large explanation of that. So hopefully I've been helpful there. But yeah, I think in my experience, people caring a lot about the USS Liberty is an indicator of not either a lack of understanding or actual malice. So yeah. So people who got shot think they got shot intentionally. That's, that doesn't really mean much to me. Body a bone. Sorry. Emma Harry 24 asks, was Netanyahu actually threatened by the protests before October 7th, and will he be in danger of losing power after the 9/11 effect wears off? Netanyahu was more than threatened by the protests. Netanyahu was forced out of power by an extremely strange coalition, including more right-wing parties than his own, and Israeli Arabs, and the party of the Israeli Arabs. So he was pushed out of government for a period of 10 months and was only able to get back into power through yet another election fatigue, I think, in part, and by making deals with some really, really nasty groups. So I think the consensus is that as soon as this war is over, Netanyahu's going to be kicked out. I think there's a real problem, though, that I think a lot of the Israeli public and most of the Israeli political scene acknowledges that great crimes are going to be committed by the Israeli government, and I think they'd rather let Netanyahu do the great crimes, and then they can kick him out afterwards and say, it's such a shame, these great crimes that Netanyahu committed. You know what, you're right. That did go a little too far, but obviously we're not going to give back the half of Gaza we're selling for waterfront property. And Netanyahu sucks. He's terrible. He's in jail here, so why would you want anything else? So I think Netanyahu is probably mostly still in power because the rest of the Israeli political scene would rather he committed the crimes that are in the process of being committed. That's interesting, bigotry. So come on, dude, either stand with Israelis or don't. This is a very anti-Semitic point that Jews and Israel are the same thing. Like it's just not the case. And if people are using an action of Israel to forward an anti-Semitic theory, I'm going to condemn it and point it out. It's actually a great service to the criminals currently running the Israeli state to conflate Jews and Israelis and to say that any defense against anti-Semitic conspiracies somehow serves the Israeli government. That's just simply not true. We shouldn't hold political or argumentative validity on whether or not one likes or hates Jews. We absolutely should. We absolutely should. How's the atmosphere in New York on the topic of Palestine, especially amongst your Jewish friends? There's some who are even more committed to speaking out about it than I am. I have numerous Jewish friends who are with Jewish Voice for Peace. Or no, I'm sorry. Yeah, what is it? Jewish Voice for Peace or Palestine? I don't know. With a number, I know at least two. In my daily life, I know at least one Jewish person who's very committed to, going to Palestine protests and whatnot. I know she gets a lot of pressure from her family in the other direction. But probably, by and large, most of the my Jewish American friends are not particularly, they don't think about the Middle East much, and aren't really invested one way or the other. And October 7th really changed that because it activated everything in their upbringing, rational parts of their upbringing, that are like, oh, persecution, death, da, da, da. And I think they're getting a lot quieter about it. In October, I would have people, this nice girl from law school, this sweetheart, just coming out like, just indignantly, how dare you call this ethnic cleansing? And I was like, because it is, and just sort of quickly demonstrated that, like, I had a lot more knowledge of what was going on than the Israeli government at this point. And she sort of backed off, but I think the point at which my Jewish American friends have, like, thought they could engage with me from a point of indignation and how dare you not support Israel, I think that point has passed. And actually, I've seen a lot of folks who were initially very, how dare you support anything other than massive bombing of every Palestinian on the planet, have now transitioned to, like, well, it's really about the hostages, and obviously I want a ceasefire, and da 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 da. So I think it continues to transition, and that's from New York, which is probably the most Jewish area in the United States. So. Oh wow! There's a Norm Finkelstein going off and Marianne Williamson. That actually, I'm amazed that they shared a debate stage. That sounds pretty amazing. Do we have more questions? You have to go read the testimony of the witness of living survivors of that willful attack on October 7th. And no question, the October 7th attack was horrific and monstrous. And there are very carefully, slickly put together videos that will, freaking hedge fund billionaires are making Harvard students sit down and watch carefully, lovingly produced details of all of these atrocities on October 7th. But by October 10th, more Palestinians had been killed. And every 3 days thereafter, more Palestinians have been killed than were killed on that one day on October 7th. And if you turn on Al Jazeera, which I refuse to do, I have zero interest in looking at dead bodies for the service of anybody's political viewpoint. And I think it's really gross that a lot of Israelis are openly promulgating this kind of slaughter porn to people. That's actually something that I think they had always had kind of a good point in pointing out, that Al Jazeera was being disrespectful to the dead by showing all of the slaughtered, dismembered bodies that Israel regularly produces. But if you're a human being, you just simply can't look at that math anymore and say, 1,200 dead Israelis, 30,000 dead Palestinians. Yeah, I'm sorry. Like, you're just not, no, okay, that shouldn't be dehumanizing. You're just really, really warped by a lot of really malicious, intentional propaganda. Go see the slaughter porn that the Israeli government carefully produced about the October 7th stuff. Disgusting, frankly. And I think for years, and it's still something that I kind of feel, but though I now sort of see the point, like, I've always hated Al Jazeera, the way that Al Jazeera is always showing the people that the United States and Israel has murdered. To see Israel, it's yet another sort of decline of Israel, in my estimation, to see them promulgating this slaughter porn about October 7th, where, again, every 3 days thereafter, that many Palestinians have been murdered by a government, Like, Hamas is a shitty little street gang that got really lucky because Netanyahu is really bad at everything he said he was good at. The Israeli government is a state supported heavily by the United States that has committed an October 7th every 3 days for the past 3 months. Yeah, I find talking about October 7th at this point, unquestionably a really big moment for Israelis and for a worldwide people of Jewish ancestry. But as of, coming up on January 7th, and the Israeli government, a state supported heavily by my tax dollars, committing an October 7th every 3 days thereafter for 3 months. Is my give a shitter on that one broken. What do you think of the Congo right now? I think it's tremendously sad. I think that there was in 2009, this became like a real standard of pro-Israeli propaganda over the past couple months, and then people have sort of abandoned it because it's kind of ridiculous. In 2009, there was a study that came out pointing out that like 40,000 people were dying a day or something in Congo, something along those lines, which I think is a bit overly estimated, but that's what I think we were calling earlier in this presentation sort of secondary deaths, because Congo, a country of, is that 80 million, had experienced such government failure through a variety of militias and whatnot. Something along, it couldn't have been 40,000 a day, but it was 40,000 a month or a week or something. People were supposedly estimated to be dying of starvation or malnutrition or disease related to the lack of what's the word I'm looking for? Related to the, sorry, I'm fading out a little bit here. Related to the lack of infrastructure in the Congo. But that's sort of a ridiculous, like, apples and oranges comparison. And also the numbers from that 2009 study were probably way too high. But that is very different from pancaking apartment buildings. The incredible ongoing tragedy of the Congo. I think largely because a CIA owned and operated guy ran the country of Zaire, as it was known at the time, from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and into the 90s. Might have a lot to do with the problems in the Congo, but that's neither here nor there. So that's what I have to say about the Congo right now. It's very sad. It would be nice if we were kinder to that place. But I think comparing what's happening in the Congo to what's happening in Gaza is ridiculous. What happened to the 40 beheaded babies? I have friends who are journalists, and I asked them about this, and this is second and third hand, and it does appear that like some babies were decapitated. That I think it's become like sort of an article of faith that's entirely nonsense. The idea of the babies in the microwave, that seems to have been nonsense. That was mostly made up. But yeah, it does seem like babies were killed. Babies were definitely killed, and that's horrific. Of course, 35, 40 Israeli babies were killed on October 7th, and dozens of Palestinian babies have been killed every day since. Certainly hundreds of Palestinian children have been killed every day since. So, it's whether whatever the truth of the 40 beheaded babies, decapitated babies, or what have you, it isn't really material to me in the face of at least 15,000 unquestionable children murdered by the Israeli government. So 40 versus 15,000, possibly more. To still be talking about October 7th this way is just morally abject. Is running for office a good or a bad idea? I don't know. It's an interesting question. Is running for office a good or a bad idea? Like for fun? Like generally? I think people should run for office. I think that we actually have tremendous power in this country through the ballot box, through putting representatives, through movements, and I think that there's a lot of learned helplessness that keeps things as screwed up as they are. Not that I think, the extermination thing in Gaza is pretty horrific, but generally I don't actually think that the United States is mired in any insoluble problems. I think we've just got a lot of greed and stupidity, and I think that the ballot box, running for office, putting together a movement around improving things a bit is an opportunity that we absolutely have in the United States. And I think what's likely is that, 10 years from now, we will have competing political parties called the Republicans and the Democrats that are actually much better and actually have real programs. But in order to do that, yes, there needs to be some competition against that, or young people in those parties who want to modernize them and bring them to better places. Okay, we are into we've done the full 2 hours, so we are going to, I've got this super chat I'm going to respond to from Lior. And basically, if you want me to keep talking after that, it's going to have to be super chats. An Israeli professor named Mordecai Kedar says that a Palestinian state should be power shared by local Arab families, clans, instead of a secular Fatastan. Are emirates a better governance for Arabs? I don't believe that. No, I think that's nonsense. I think that's that seems like, I don't know, maybe there's something, maybe Mordecai Kedar has got some kind of basis. I don't want to entirely dismiss him, out of hand. But it sounds kind of ridiculous to me. It sounds like the kind of research that, the Saudis would support, or I don't know, the United Arab Emirates would support. If a government has nearly infinite oil and gas wealth, then they can survive as a monarchy. I think a lot of the reason that these monarchies survived up and down the Gulf was because the United States liked monarchies better than communist states. But I don't think that's been good for Arab governance in any way. In fact, I think it's been horrible that the richest, the most wealthy states in the Arab world have been set up by the United States as absolute monarchs. I think it's a betrayal of U.S. founding ideals, among many other things. And the fact that since the Arab Spring, which was a tremendous uprising in the Arab world for better government, these monarchies interfered in every country that moved forward to push them backwards. So no, I think it's absurd to say that emirates are a better governance for Arabs, that Arabs are somehow constitutionally incapable of being participants in representative democracy. There have been plenty of Palestinians in the U.S. Congress, it's just absurd. And a little bigoted. Again, I don't want to be unfair to Mordecai Kedar on the basis of just hearing that one thing, but that does not seem like something I'd agree with on any level. Thoughts on Fed's proposed rate cuts next year that will cause an increase in support for Biden? Not really troubled by that. I think it's probably a good thing. We have successfully beaten inflation, so it's time to bring rates down a little bit. Should they cut to zero? Absolutely not. But a little bit of goosing the economy would also be very good for housing to do that. So I don't think we're talking about... the Fed is considering cutting rates next year, not because Biden wants to be reelected, but because the inflation, beating inflation seems largely to have happened. That's why that's happening. Right, so I think we've done 2 hours. My name is Robert Morris. I upload things here on YouTube. If you want more regular content, at this point, I guess you should probably join the Patreon, where we do patrons-only newscast, which I guess I'm going to have to do this weekend or next weekend. And we also do a Discord call. So that's two 2-hour pieces of content if you sign up for Patreon. Our Discord server is only available to patrons. So if you've enjoyed the content provided today, you should sign up on Patreon. I provide a lot of links to that. And you should join the patrons-only Discord server. I don't know. I feel like I should stop making promises about content that I produce, because it's just not been happening between getting sick and whatnot. So certainly going to try to make more videos that are publicly available sometime soon, but keeps not happening. Do you think that Biden's reelection is doomed? It's definitely the wrong choice. I think especially now, at this point, we're still 11 months out, or I guess 10 months out, less and less time all the time. Now that we're still 10 months out, this is the time to pick somebody who's a better candidate. I think that's entirely possible that, we could have hundreds of thousands of dead people in Gaza. We could have any number of age-related embarrassments that could accumulate over the next 10, 11 months. Continuing to maintain Biden as the Democratic candidate strikes me as incredibly risky and a really bad idea, and we should definitely not do that. Unfortunately, that seems to be what Biden and the Democratic Party are currently committed to. Is it doomed? Is he absolutely going to lose? There's certainly a lot of polling at this point that would illustrate that would sort of support that conclusion. I don't think that's actually, we're still 11 months out. The inflation scourge that has been a huge problem for Biden's presidency is now largely over. It has been largely defeated. The Fed can lower rates, and it's entirely possible that we will get a large stock market and economic boom across 2024 if that happens. Trump is also not super electable. This dude has lost 2 popular votes and has lost 1 electoral college vote. I don't think Biden is doomed. I just think he's a really bad choice, and the Democratic Party and America could do a lot better. So that's what I think. That's where I'm at there. Any more super chats? Because I think I am only 10 months, and I'm not seeing anything about the election. Well, I'm seeing a lot about the election, but perhaps it's because I'm looking for it. It's important. It's always important. Not as important as kicking Trump out, but putting Trump back in would be a terrible historic mistake. All right, I think I'm going to close it here. Delightful to have so many people on TikTok and YouTube. Y'all are the best. Thanks for being here, and goodbye.